example of that? How would someone know if they've lost themselves to coupleness or coupledom? How do you know what is the distinction between losing oneself to coupledom versus extending or offering oneself to this entity of couple?
As a single man, and I think others who are single and have friends that get in a relationship can attest to an experience of abandonment that comes when someone gets into a relationship. And the question is, are you abandoning something unhealthy for something healthy? Or are you abandoning something that helps sustain your well-being for an idea that has not been proven?
Whoa, so almost like losing oneself in the prediction of the future rather than bringing the present and growing it.
100%.
So what would that look like? Okay, just really quick, I want to back up to what you said about you keep putting out these qualifiers about being a single man speaking into relationship, and at the same time I think there's in relationship there's like this element of commitment, and when we are committed to one person we learn how to adapt to that sort of entity, that coupledom. When we have this diverse set of relationships that is more common, I think, for people who are single because we have more of ourselves to go around.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is easy to diminish the many different ways that you commit yourselves in the relationships that you have, whether with your family, with your friends, with your job, with your things you're passionate about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you, in my experience of you, so I've known you for a while now. We've known each other for like, what, 4 years, 5 years?
Something like that.
Yeah. You are committed to the things that are in your heart and the things that you create around you.
Yes.
Commitment is a very strong part of who I think you are. And so teaching people the ways that you commit to things that you choose to give your attention to,
Mm-hmm.
that commitment is the baseline, that's the roots of what is coupledom, right? It's a sort of a commitment to something, to someone, to a way of being, to a space. I don't know, perhaps I'm wrong, but...
No, I love you're inspiring a bunch of thoughts and questions. And the question, I don't even know how relevant it is to this topic, so help me if it's too much of a tangent. But my question is, when your commitment is to a commandment versus your well-being or your authentic expression of identity, and the reason that concept comes to mind is because when you were listing all the different relationships, very few relationships can demand your commitment. You can offer it, and it's typically you're offering a commitment to them as a friend or whatever. But then in coupleness, there's some sort of expectation that can become a command for your commitment. Similar with a job. I think some of the reasons that jobs have become somewhat of a toxic concept is not because work inherently is bad. I think work is important to value, but I think there's a commandment because of the structure of an 8-hour day of, I need to see you for you to be bringing value. You need to be in this office, this box, this space for you to do your job well when I'm not doing your job. And if I'm trusting you to do it well and not trust you to do it how you can do it best, those are commandments that I think people submit themselves to, and in the process lose the opportunity to be their best selves and bring their best selves.
That's really interesting that you say that, because as you were talking, I was remembering just a minute ago, I was kind of thinking and writing down, I remember writing that discomfort or even stress is not necessarily traumatic unless you cannot say no, unless you cannot say stop. And sometimes the no and the stop aren't necessarily an exit, It's not necessarily I exit the situation, but sometimes the no or the stop can be just a tuning into self, tuning into my breath, taking my attention away from this task, this demand, this 8-hour stretch of time, whatever it is, but just I'm going to take a little break. And I think occupational boundaries are a very significant gray area. And I think about from beginning to end that we are committed to a job, or that you said submit yourself to this 8-hour demand. I think occupational boundaries are not always allowed. I think from the moment you sit down and you read the job description and you see what's expected of you, from the moment that you sit in that interview and you say, what can I expect from this job? What do I expect from my employer? What do they expect of me? There's this inherent, not necessarily explicitly stated, space of like, you don't get to say no to a task, a project. You don't get to say no to the time constraints, the 8 hours. And I think a lot of companies around the world are playing with this and saying, how is this detrimental? How does this squelch someone being able to bring their full selves? And so I think they're playing around with things like, how do we create space for someone to maybe exercise at work, or maybe we only do a 4-day work week, or maybe I think there's a company in Canada, I believe it is, that recently just made I can't remember the name of it, but where they made a statement where people are allowed to say no to meetings.
I think that brings in the nuance to the word that I actually used was command versus demand. Because I feel like demand, you can say no to a demand. That's what negotiation is. Someone makes demands and you say no. But a command, from the concept of a command, to say no is to be rebellious or wrong.
Oh, that's like super powerful, because then I think to myself, okay, depending on how you are identified in gender, depending on how you're identified in status in the company, depending on how you're identified in your social resources, depending on how you're identified in your race, that means something very different to every person.
True.
And so there are cues in the environment, cues in the job, in the command, that tell somebody, and it relies on all of their past experiences. It brings up all the past. It brings up every experience that they've had into that moment of how do I respond? What boundary am I allowed to set so that I don't lose my future, that I don't lose my resources, that I don't lose my voice in this moment.
I mean, you don't even have to go past the word "so I don't lose," because there's a world that you could add "so I don't lose," and I think we're tapping into some of the tension that we see in our nation and in governments around the world, because the question is, who has the authority to command?
Well, and I think that perhaps there is a social calling or request, or maybe even a demand for that to shift.
I 100% agree, and that is my passion in my coaching, because I think the question of who has the authority or right to command is somehow entwined with the question, who has my well-being prioritized?
So
Who's looking out for me? And one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that every individual needs to live their life with their well-being prioritized.
How does one do that? So how does one do that? So I think about, so in the work that I do, I talk a lot about self-care, and some of the times the dirty word that has become, or it's become, like, especially for healthcare professionals, that is like another task. That's another to-do list, and it creates more and more and fosters sometimes the discussion around it, more and more compassion fatigue. And it's like, now we've taken that compassion fatigue that's just plaguing everyone, not everyone, but a large portion, and we turn it on ourselves. And now it's like, I'm exhausted because I have to take care of myself. But then we have this self-care in the context of community care, but even that is like, in a pandemic, we don't have access to those resources that typically go hand in hand. They connect self-care and community care. So there's a fine balance between being self-reliant, but also being responsible for our own care, being responsible for setting our own boundaries, being responsible for our well-being, but also putting a demand, again, that word demand, on our environment to not only allow us to be responsible for our well-being, but also to help allow us to educate the community, whether it's a person or an environment or a job, how to utilize the gift that is us, but also allow us to engage in that stress and repair cycle that is on a cellular level, what stress and recovery, stress and self-care, stress and that stress cycle finishing. Because it is stressful to work 8 hours a day. It is stressful to try to bring an entire organization, to elevate an entire organization. That is a stress. It's a task. It demands something of our resources and of ourselves. But how do we sit in this space in our jobs, take responsibility for ourselves, but also allow our community to be a part of that process as well?
My approach to that is, I guess, prefaced with something I often say, that hurt isn't always harm. And when you say,
I've heard you say that.
when you say stress,
a couple hundred times.
Stress seemed like it was synonymous with hurt, and that stress isn't always harm. And so my thought again is, coming from a perspective of faith. I come from a family, 5th generation Pentecostal preacher family, having had both positive and negative or formative and constructive experiences in that context. And desiring to have a broader context, I recognize that one of the concepts within the faith framework is really identifying self-sacredness. And I know it gets twisted, and I know there are different spins and definitions or narratives around that, but I really personally believe that a deep understanding of self-sacredness is going to lead to a revolution of honoring the sacredness within each of us, within one another. Because I don't think, outside of understanding the importance of the sacredness of humanity, that begins with understanding the sacredness of my humanity, that I can understand the sacredness of us.
Whoa, can you say that again?
I don't think we can fully come to a place where we celebrate the sacredness of each other until I've understood my own sacredness as being one of us.
So what does that look like in a job when you're at work throughout the day? What is that? How does that pop up? What is the opportunity to acknowledge one's sacredness and that breeding or flowing into the sacredness of us?
I personally believe that's homework. I personally believe that's personal. I believe that it is each individual's responsibility within their ability to understand and nurture and honor that sense of self-sacredness. Now, the hard part is the concept is so unfamiliar.
How would you get more familiar with the concept? I
Okay.
know you said it's personal, so
It's
I
personal.
also, in that, I hear that there's no real one wrong way or one right way, and that it's not going to look the same.
It's within the concept of another word with a lot of tension, and that's spirit and spiritual. And the problem is because religion has monopolized the concept of spirituality, and because it's difficult to even have a conversation about spirituality without just losing everybody from the religious to the non-religious. It's really hard. And then if you want to try and use language that can fit everyone and start talking about universe and energy, then you still lose a lot of people. So I mean, I think that's one of the areas that I'm looking to. That's my passion, and I'm trying to understand the best articulation so that I can really bring the value that is hard, that is universal. When people have worshiped or found and created, yes, okay to say created religion. People have found these narratives and have had these experiences and shared them, and people have gathered around them, and there's been communities and nations gathered around these important things. So that it has to be important, but the problem is it's no longer personal.
So there's a balance. There's a balance of weaving between community and personal, and bringing personal into community, which builds and creates community.
I think yes, and interestingly, when you said that, what launched into my thinking is how things went from being oral history to the technology of the printing press that literally took, for an example of Christianity, where you have this oral narrative and the ideas and the values are shared communally, till you get the printing press where people start having it in smaller and smaller communities. Then I have this personal Bible that I can have with myself, not understanding that it was, while it may speak to situations that I have, it's not literally to me. You know, and I know that will make a lot of church folks mad that I didn't say the Bible is like to, but it's not to. It might be for you. It might be a good tool for you, but it's definitely not to you.
That's interesting, because if you think about any other historical book, any other historical writing, it's not to you.
It's not to you.
Yeah, but it is someone expressing an experience.
And it's definitely for you.
A thought through philosophy.
Or a testimony, which is like in technology. You need someone to do research and to document the research so that we can learn and experience the benefit of what's shown itself consistent.
Yeah, I was just reading yesterday Ralph Waldo Emerson. Yeah. I didn't know him. I should know him, but I didn't know his works. But he was talking, I was reading in his literature. So he was from the 1900s and 19th century. So he was from the 1800s. That's kind of the duration of his life. And he was a philosopher and essayist. And he talked about conformity. He talked about how consistency, and I don't know why this just brought up consistency, but I was thinking about this idea of people saying that this is for me. Well, if we're saying it's for you, but your experience is super unique and personal, how is the consistency the thing that we value the most is that this is true for everyone, but how can it be true for everyone when everyone's experience is so different? And I appreciated what he was talking about in terms of, he said consistency can become a foolish thing if we don't allow ourselves to adjust with what is necessary and needed in the moment. So I was thinking about what you said in terms of, so his writing, right? So he's from the 1800s, the 19th century, and his works are still cited today in education and in all sorts of different educations, from your AA degree all the way up. So he's still discussed, and his thoughts but they're not written to me. He didn't write for me. He didn't even know who I was. But that doesn't mean that he isn't applied to me.
I love it.
So I appreciate what you're saying. I think it's important.
And I hope this conversation, once shared, inspires others to have conversations like these. Or I hope that those who are viewing will reach out to us, because we exist to serve in different contexts and different capacities. I believe we do work to give thought to what people feel like they don't have time to think about.
I like it.
And in our energy and in our giving our lives to give thought, that's really where you have thought leaders, but the value of being a thought leader is probably under a market saturation with the whole concept of influencer.
Yeah.
But it makes it no less important that there be thought leaders. And so I thank you for this conversation because it's inspired me to take myself a little more seriously, which basically means to honor my sacredness.
Can I ask before we can wrap this up, if maybe each of us could talk about one way that we have done that in the last week, or perhaps
Done what?
honored the self-sacredness at work, in community, in just a given moment, at some point in the last week, and or maybe how we intend to do that in the future, or this next week.
Yeah, interesting. I love the question. For me, picking something I delighted to wear, showering and putting on cologne
Yeah.
was my expression of self-sacredness. Where I could easily just leave the house, I'll call him back. But I'll have to call him soon. But yeah, it was that. Meeting you was an example of honoring the sacredness of community. Yeah.
I think this last week, there's a book that I had started in December that I really wanted to read, and it was an amazing novel. I don't read often a lot of novels. And I took time on the plane when I was coming here to just put my earplugs in and read, and I was able to finish the book, and it was beautiful, and I allowed myself, in the midst of this airplane, in the midst of all the people that are around, to just feel the emotion and express them in the way that the writing was drawing out of me. And so there were moments when I was laughing, there was moments when I was crying, there was moments when I just felt I felt the characters in the story and their own story of belonging. But I just allowed, I think, my own body to experience that moment, to experience that author who wasn't speaking to me, but still spoke to some things that were really important to me in terms of belonging, just even what we're talking about, but just allowed that to happen in the midst of a community.
I love you that you shared that. I love that you shared that. Thank you.
Thank you.
As always, we're going to have to make sure that this was captured well. The audio sounds okay, because we're embarking on expanding and honoring our sacredness, and with that, having a sacred offering to offer the world.
Yeah.
So I hope that this is recorded and done well enough for us to share. And you'll find out if you're watching.
Then it happened.
It didn't happen. So, yeah, there's that.